Gregory B. Craig is a trial lawyer who has successfully defended individuals and organizations in a number of high-profile criminal and civil proceedings, including representing UN Secretary General Kofi Annan in connection with the Volcker Commission's investigation of the Oil for Food program at the United Nations, Juan Miguel Gonzalez in a successful effort to regain custody of his son Elian, and as assistant to President Bill Clinton and special counsel in the White House during the impeachment proceedings. His experience also extends to administrative, antitrust, and appellate law, as well as arbitration, employment, and labor, First Amendment, and media, and international disputes. He received his AB from Harvard College, magna cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, a diploma in historical studies from Cambridge University, and a JD from Yale Law School. The topic for his presentation today is the UN scandal that wasn't, understanding the Volcker report. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Gregory Craig.
Thank you, Corey. I'm glad to be back with my friends in Provo. Sometimes in our desire to be profound, we miss the obvious. In an early draft of The Hound of the Baskervilles, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle had Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson camping in the moors one night. And in the middle of the night, Holmes woke up and shook Watson, declaring, "Look at the sky, Watson. What do you see?" Watson replied, "I see stars, millions and millions of stars." "And what does that tell you, Watson?" asked Holmes. Watson paused for a moment and said, "Astronomically, it tells me that there are millions of galaxies and countless planets in them. Astrologically, it tells me that Saturn is in Leo. Meteorologically, it tells me that we will have fair weather tomorrow. Theologically, it tells me that God is all-powerful and that we are small and insignificant." Holmes said nothing. Watson finally asked, "Well, Holmes, what does all this beauty and grandeur tell you?" The great detective paused and then said, "Watson, you idiot, it tells me that someone has stolen our tent." Now, I hope I don't commit the sin of the effort to be profound at the expense of being obvious. But I come here today to talk to you a little bit about a recent experience I had representing the Secretary General of the United States in the Volcker Committee investigation of the Oil for Food program. Last year, near the end of that investigation, the United States celebrated the 50th anniversary of the signing of the UN Charter in San Francisco. New York City was a mess as a result. 155 heads of state arrived to attend the event, and each had his or her own motorcade. And they, in working together, choked the city and for a moment brought life, at least on the streets of downtown Manhattan, to a complete halt. The city was in gridlock, which some observed was symbolically appropriate inasmuch as the organization of the UN itself, for many other reasons having nothing to do with bad traffic, appeared to be paralyzed as well. The source of the UN's paralysis in September 2005 was threefold. First, it was the paralyzing influence of the Cold War replaced by the North-South confrontation that had, with similar effect as the Cold War, tied up the organization. For another, the reform movement aimed at strengthening the office of the Secretary General and, among other things, reconstituting the Commission on Human Rights was stymied by the unwillingness of the majority in the General Assembly to give way to the desires of the great powers who control the most powerful organ of the UN, the Security Council. A third source of paralysis at that particular moment was the investigation that was coming to an end by the Independent Inquiry Committee of the Oil for Food program, an investigation which had diplomats of all colors and stripes and types scurrying for cover. Now, during my representation of the Secretary General during those weeks and months of 2004 and 2005, I had a bird's eye view from the 37th floor of the UN building where his office is. And I watched this so-called scandal unroll. And I discovered that the scandal never measured up in reality to its advertisements. And the truth about the oil for food scandal is very difficult to find today. You will look long and hard for an easily digestible presentation. You will find it nowhere in the speeches of our political leaders or in seasoned diplomats' memos or reports. Nor will you find the truth of this matter in the media at that moment or any moment since. And you would have to purchase and then plow through a report 5 volumes in length, which was the product of the Volcker Committee's work, to get an understanding of what this scandal was all about, purportedly all about. But for many months during this period of time that I was working for the Secretary General, it was widely reported that the corruption in the oil for food program at the United Nations was so rampant as to undermine confidence in Kofi Annan's leadership as Secretary General and to threaten the viability of the United Nations as an institution itself. Let me give you some examples. William Safire, the columnist for the New York Times, described the oil for food program as, quote, history's largest swindle, unquote, and reported that $20 billion had been stolen from the program. The U.S. Government Accountability Office, with somewhat more reserve, pegged the corruption at a modest $10.1 billion. MSNBC, on the other hand, described the oil for food scandal as involving the diversion of $100 billion, which was in excess of the entire revenues generated by the oil for food program in all its transactions from 1996 through 2003. Fox News went berserk, calling it a multi-billion-dollar boondoggle and the biggest graft-generating machine ever, and reported that Saddam Hussein, quote, pocketed in his own pocket millions, if not billions of dollars, and was responsible for putting millions of dollars in the hands of potential terrorists. Long before any investigation had been contemplated, conducted, much less concluded, Senator Norm Coleman of Minnesota, the chairman of the Senate Subcommittee on Permanent Investigations, called for Kofi Annan's resignation, called the oil for food program a, quote, oil-drenched sea of corruption and incompetence, and concluded that the program was, quote, a hornet's nest of corruption and evil. He was joined by a chorus of senators who sensed Kofi Annan's vulnerability and saw an opportunity to get even for the Secretary General not being more enthusiastic about the war in Iraq. And there were those in Washington, D.C. who saw the oil for food scandal and salivated at the prospect of a possible public relations trifecta, which those of us who play lacrosse or hockey recognize as being a hat trick, 3 goals in a single game. 1, a scandal that could damage the reputation of the Clinton administration, which is always desirable in the eyes of some. 2, to destroy Kofi Annan, who had problems with popularity in Washington, D.C. And 3, to denigrate the United Nations, to achieve all 3 objectives in one fell swoop. And so when the Secretary General sought Security Council approval to create and fund a special inquiry, the tabloids, the gossip mongers, Fox News, and the Washington spinmeisters started licking their chops, and the investigation began. The Secretary General appointed Paul Volcker, a former chairman of the Federal Reserve Board and public-spirited icon of the New York civic scene, to be the chairman of a 3-man panel of commissioners, which was really the tribunal that I appeared before with the Secretary General and which presided over the investigation. The other 2 members of the panel were Richard J. Goldstone, who was a member of the Supreme Court formerly of South Africa, also had served on a war crimes tribunal, very distinguished jurist. Mark Pieth, a law professor and expert in money laundering from Switzerland. And the panel assembled a team of lawyers, expert and experienced lawyers, 75 in number, counting the investigators, who traveled all over the world gathering evidence. The only person I think that they didn't interview who had some knowledge and experience and probably information to convey about the oil for food program was Saddam Hussein, who was preoccupied. The United Nations spent over $36 million of Iraq's oil money investigating the allegations, and the result is this 2,160-page report, which I think was a superhuman achievement, because they did this all in about a year and a half. I mean, it was really quite extraordinary. But the results of this report have largely, maybe because it's so voluminous and so complex, and because the predispositions were so profound, the results have largely been ignored by those, and in particularly those who beat the drums the loudest about the program and the scandal before the investigation did its work. To understand the final report, it's important, first of all, to understand what the Oil for Food program was and why it came into existence. You will recall that after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1991, the UN authorized military action against Iraq, and the first President Bush, with the approval and blessing of the UN, assembled a genuine international coalition of nations which, under the military leadership of the United States, joined together to drive the Iraqi army out of Kuwait. But when the hostilities ended, the concern remained, as we all know, about Iraq's capacity to rearm itself and to develop and manufacture weapons of mass destruction. To address that concern, the United Nations adopted two policies. An economic embargo, which prevented Iraq from selling its oil in the world market and using the proceeds of those sales to purchase weapons or equipment, and an inspection regime, which has gotten a good deal of attention, consisting of an international team of independent investigators under the auspices of the IAEA, called UNSCOM, who would go from site to site inside Iraq with unannounced inspections, looking for evidence of weapons of mass destruction, and when finding them, destroying them, which they did with respect to biochemical and chemical weapons. In truth, like every embargo, this embargo had its problems. It was weak in some respects and leaky in others, and the inspection regime, as those of us in the administration at the State Department during the middle 90s knew very well, the inspection regime was a day-to-day thing. Saddam Hussein, with the support of the Russian government, went out of his way over and over again to defeat the efforts of the inspectors, and their work was really heroic. So that in the 5 years that followed the Gulf War, there was enormous pressure on the embargo. And there were two reasons for that pressure. One was, and the pressure actually threatened the viability of the embargo itself. One of the reasons it was threatened was because of the allegations and the evidence that the embargo was damaging the health and welfare of the Iraqi people. Medical doctors from Western universities and Western governments visited Iraq and came back claiming that Iraqi children were dying in the thousands of malnutrition because of the embargo. And because of this problem, the embargo itself was under constant assault by humanitarian groups who said that the people of Iraq should not suffer for the misdeeds of Saddam Hussein. To save the embargo, Boutros Boutros-Ghali, who was the Secretary General at the time, it was not Kofi Annan, it was Boutros Boutros-Ghali, negotiated the Oil for Food program with Saddam Hussein, allowing the UN to preside over a system whereby Iraq could sell oil and use the money made from the sales of that oil to buy commodities which would, by the UN program, be distributed among the Iraqi people for humanitarian purposes. This was the concept that gave birth to the program in 1996, and the United States at that time enthusiastically supported the program because they saw it as the only way to keep this important embargo and inspections regime intact. The second problem with the embargo was the fact that it wreaked havoc on the economies of neighboring states. Two states in particular, both friends of the United States, Jordan and Turkey, were hard hit by the halting of all economic activity with the 26 million Iraqis. But even more than that, were totally dependent upon Iraq for their source of fuel oil and petroleum. And these two countries, if they could not get that oil and that petroleum, would suffer enormously. Now, there's a provision in the UN Charter that says the UN has an obligation to compensate any country that's been damaged by a UN-sponsored embargo. There's absolutely no ability for the UN to compensate countries that are damaged by UN embargoes, but nonetheless there it is, hopeful language in the Charter. And if Jordan and Turkey and Syria was another government that suffered, had sought to enforce that provision, the UN would have owed these nations billions and billions of dollars, which they could not have paid. Now, the reality is the permanent members of the Security Council, including those who most strongly supported the embargo and were most interested in keeping Saddam Hussein constrained and contained, the United States and the UK, these members of the Security Council turned a blind eye to the fact that from the very beginning of the embargo, Iraqi oil flowed across the Turkish-Iraqi border, across the Jordanian-Iraqi border, and later on during the first Bush administration, this Bush, across the Syrian-Iraqi border, usually in tanker trucks, in a business-as-usual fashion. And everybody knew about this illicit trafficking in Iraqi oil. This was known as the smuggling problem. And no one made any effort to shut it down. And so with the full knowledge of the UK and the US and all the permanent members of the Security Council, Saddam Hussein, through this smuggling program, was able to put billions of dollars into his pockets, all with a wink and a nod from the very governments that had the most at stake in containing him. Now, in the course of my representation of the Secretary General, I interviewed a number of senior diplomats on this subject in order to write up their interviews for the purposes of the Commission. And I'm going to quote from Peter Burley's notes that I took, that he authorized me to use with the Volcker Committee on this subject. This is our ambassador to the UN at that time. Quote, "When it came to the issue of oil smuggling, both the US and the UK were fully aware that oil was being transported from Iraq into Turkey and Jordan without UN approval. For policy reasons, the US and the UK decided not to raise the subject with either the 661 Committee of the Security Council was the committee authorized to preside over the oil for food program, and he said they decided not to raise the subject with either the 661 Committee of the Security Council. The chairman of the 661 Committee at the time was the Dutch ambassador to the United Nations, a man by the name of Ambassador Peter van Walsum, who said, the abnormality of the whole regime, referring to the oil for food structure, should not be underestimated. Everybody knew that oil smuggling to Jordan and Turkey was being condoned. By whom was not clear. Was it the whole permanent 5 membership of the Security Council, or was it just the US and the UK? He says this, "I believe that even the US Congress was kept informed of the magnitude of this technically illicit operation. And then under the Bush administration, all these irregularities are being lumped together and laid at the door of the Secretariat." That was what the chairman of the 661 Committee said. Now, there were, in fact, terrible structural flaws in the way the program had been set up. And how did that happen? The reason it happened was because the United Nations wanted the oil for food program much more than Saddam Hussein wanted it. Saddam Hussein was perfectly happy to have his population starved because that was a tool that he could use to lift the hated embargo, to rally and mobilize public opinion internationally against the embargo, and he was in fact in no hurry to set up a system that would take that leverage away from him. To induce Saddam Hussein to agree to the program, the UN gave him an important concession as to how the program would be structured. And once again, I quote from the chairman of the 661 Committee, who had the responsibility of presiding over the program. Well, how was it structured, and why was it structured this way? Saddam Hussein, he said, could decide whom he would sell oil to and whom he would buy humanitarian goods from. Such a situation invited corruption. How could the Security Council ever have gone along with such an absurdity? We used to call the resolution the original sin. It had irreparably damaged the oil for food program, and in this case there was no redemption. This single aspect of the oil for food program, Iraq's ability to decide who could buy Iraqi oil and its ability to determine who would be permitted to sell humanitarian materials, gave the Iraqi government a key to circumvent the embargo. And they did not hesitate to use that key. They used it in such a fashion as to funnel special payments into bank accounts outside of Iraq in circumvention of the Oil for Food program and in circumvention of the economic embargo. And because Iraq had control over all these private sector actors, the oil companies, the 2,050 companies that were selling wheat and tea and food inside the country, they were able to circumvent the embargo. He forced these companies who wanted to do business with Iraq to do the following. If you were buying Iraqi oil, you had to pay a surcharge. How did they do that? They would tell the oil company, we're charging you 10 cents, it went up to 50 cents a barrel, in addition to the amount of oil we're permitting you to buy from us, and you put that account in an account over here in Dubai, or this account that we've set up in Amman, Jordan. If you were selling, those are the surcharges. If you were selling humanitarian materials to inside Iraq, you had to pay kickbacks. That was what they called them, kickbacks. For you to participate in the Oil for Food program, don't tell the UN, by the way, but you have to pay 10% of the value of what the contract is in this account in Dubai, or this account in Syria, or that account in Amman, Jordan. And they disguised it, they identified it as handling fees or transportation costs, and this was called the kickbacks. So we've got three categories here of payments that are outside the embargo, that violate the embargo. And it's these three categories of payments. The smuggling payments, where Turkey and Jordan paid the Iraqis directly for the oil that was being transported in the tankers. The smuggling payments, the kickbacks involving the companies who were selling humanitarian goods, and the surcharges. Now, the truth is that virtually everyone knew about the smuggling, they knew about the oil surcharges, and they knew about the kickbacks. And the Security Council chose, as a matter of policy, to do nothing about it. Let me give you what Jeremy Greenstock, who was the UK ambassador to the UN at the time, and our closest ally in the effort to enforce the embargo against Iraq, what he said to me that I provided to the committee. In the end, it was the Clinton and Bush administrations who made the decision not to take on the smuggling of oil that was going on across the Iraq-Syrian border. They presumably made that decision because they did not want to call attention to comparable activities with Turkey and Jordan. Secretary of State Powell traveled to Syria, discussed the issue with the Syrian leadership, and that was the end of it. The U.S. did not pursue the issue energetically at that point. So 2 presidents, 3 U.S. ambassadors to the UN turned a blind eye to the smuggling. The Volcker Committee found that between 1996 and 2003, the Iraqi government, in the form of payments for the smuggled oil, took in $11 billion that is attributable to the smuggling. Now, those smuggling dollars in no way, shape, or form can be attributed to Oil for Food programs. Many people attribute that, but this was a policy decision by the government of the United States and others to allow that smuggling to go on and to allow that revenue to flow into Saddam Hussein's accounts. But, says Jeremy Greenstock, the laxity on smuggling affected the way the Iraqis perceived the entire system. The fact that they were allowed opportunities to sell their oil in one area gave them an undue sense of freedom in other areas. The UN did nothing about the smuggling, made it more difficult to be serious with the Iraqis about the other infractions. Now, the Volcker Committee concluded that yes, the Security Council knew what was going on. The problem was discussed both formally and informally in the 661 Council. I quote Ambassador Burley, quote, "The issue of oil surcharges, for example, was well known. It is my belief that the issue of surcharges was discussed frequently in formal sessions of the 661 Committee as well as informally among the representatives. But as virtually everything else involving Iraq, there was no consensus among the great powers about how to address this problem. The U.S. would propose something, the French would object. The UK would propose something, the Russians would object. And so the problem continued. As Van Walsum described it, either the P5, meaning the Permanent Five, would disagree among themselves and then everything was blocked, or they reached a consensus and made a deal with great difficulty, and then the elected members were told not to touch it for fear that it might fall through. The result was so chaotic that normal rules of management simply did not apply to the Oil for Food program. The Volcker Committee concluded that between 1996 and 2003, the Iraqi government unlawfully took, in the course of the Oil for Food program, $229 million attributable to oil surcharges. With respect to the problem of kickbacks, they concluded that it was a much more serious problem than they had understood, or that the 661 committee had understood, and that the Iraqi government took in approximately $1.6 billion attributable to kickbacks. Now, did we know this was going on? We certainly did know this was going on, because American companies came to the United States government and complained that they were not getting the contracts that other governments were getting, that were paying the special payments, making the kickback payments into the Iraqi accounts. But the truth of the matter was that there was no great likelihood that the Iraqis were going to come to American governments to sell food and commodities inside of Iraq. That was the last place they were going to go to buy. They weren't going to buy American wheat, they'd buy Australian wheat. They weren't going to buy American rice, they would buy Japanese or Chinese rice. But our focus at this time, and the focus of American officials, was entirely on the issue of whether any of these contracts was going to allow dual-use items to get into Iraq that could be used for rearming or developing weapons of mass destruction. At the end of the investigation, the members of the Volcker Committee concluded that the Oil for Food scandal was dirty, was unattractive, but it certainly was not a secret. Everybody knew what was going on, and everybody allowed it to go forward. Now, in the public, the Oil for Food scandal was advertised with the words that I quoted earlier: bribery, theft, stolen, corruption, graft, as if there were individuals pocketing money in their own pockets and running off and putting them in bank accounts in the Cayman Islands or Panama. There was evidence of one individual who took money improperly, and we think it was associated with influence that he had over the program. Mr. Benan Savan, who was the director of the Oil for Food program from Cyprus, made unexplained cash deposits in his own personal account over a 3-year period in the amount of $147,000 that he explained as coming from his great aunt's legacy, but the committee believed was payments from a company in Egypt that got access to the oil allocation that he was responsible for. What we too frequently forget is the fact that the Oil for Food program ultimately did what it was designed to do. It fed 26 million Iraqis for 7 years. And without that kind of food assistance to Iraq, it would have been impossible, arguably, to sustain the embargo. And without the embargo, it would have been impossible to sustain our effort to contain Saddam Hussein. We now know that the UN inspection efforts inside of Iraq were largely successful. We also now know that the proceeds of the smuggling, the proceeds of the Oil for Food diversions, which amounted to about $1.8 billion, were not used to build nuclear weapons, not used to build weapons of mass destruction, but were used to build palaces. And that's where the money came to build all these incredible, monstrosity, ornate palaces. Now, one of the great benefits of this report and the committee's work is that it did, in fact, highlight and brought new attention to the importance of reform in the United Nations. Does the UN have these problems, these organizational problems? They certainly do. Is it in need of reform? Absolutely no question. Should the Secretary General's office be strengthened? Yes, it should. Should there be an independent audit function operating within the UN? Yes. Should there be an Inspector General? Of course. Could the Oil for Food program have been managed better? Yes. And Kofi Annan took responsibility, saying that he could have gone more public, he could have raised the alarm more publicly than he did. He knew that everybody else knew about it, so he didn't. And he spent more time trying to work with the disarmament programs than with the oil for food. Does this so-called scandal suggest that the United Nations is so corrupt and so compromised that it's no longer useful? I don't think so. What's happened to the UN today is fascinating and represents what's happening, I think, in the world. It's an honest reflection of circumstances in the world, because there are political and cultural problems at work today that cannot be ignored and are reflected in what goes on at the UN. During the first 45 years of the UN's existence, the gridlock and the paralysis inside the UN was attributable to the Cold War and the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union rarely agreed on what should be done. And it occurred, that confrontation, every day in the heart of the United Nations and the Security Council, and it made it difficult for the United Nations to carry out its mission. Today, the problem is different. It's a north-south problem. And when I say north, I'm talking about the developed, the industrialized, the largely affluent post-industrial countries. And when I talk about the south, I'm talking about the less developed, more poverty-stricken countries. But this north-south polarity in the world afflicts and affects everything that the UN tries to do, including, unfortunately, its efforts to reform itself. Let me tell you why. The effects of the North and the concerns of the North and the preoccupations of the North are not only not those of the South does not care about these as nearly as much, but they exacerbate the fears of the South. The concerns of the North make the South more fearful. And that is the real explanation for the impasse that we see in the UN today. The North, for example, cares about winning the war on terrorism, about Islamic and jihadist fundamentalism, about human rights violations, about genocide, the rule of law, corruption, peace, good governance, security, economic liberalization, and strengthening the private sector. The North wants a strong Secretary General and, above all, wants an effective peacekeeping and robust peacekeeping capability. The South cares about economic development, alleviation of poverty, reduction of third world debt, free trade with the industrialized world without subsidies for our agricultural products so that they have a market here. Above all, the South cares about preserving its sovereignty. You know, the North, by the way, has made more compromises on sovereignty than we ever could have imagined. Europe, which fought wars that cost millions and millions of lives over borders, are now breaking down their borders, and the sovereignty of Europe as a set of finite Westphalian nation states is much more compromised than ever before, much to everybody's relief. That sovereignty, the southern countries care about more than anything, and they feel threatened in an era of overpowering technology, of forces that globalize their economies, and above all of the pervasive influence and power of the United States. Not just its military domination, but its political, economic, and social influence around the world. Now, this problem between the North and the South gets played out in the General Assembly versus the Security Council, because it's by and large the industrial nations, the powerful nations that dominate the powerful organ of the UN, which is the Security Council, and it's by and large the majority of the nations in the General Assembly that are from the South, undeveloped, poverty-stricken, and worried about maintaining their own sovereignty. That's the impasse that we're dealing with today. It's not a bunch of evil people opposing reform. It's people pursuing their own national interests as they see it. And it should not and will not in the long run prevent the UN from continuing to do much of the work that is so important and that it does so well. There was no other organization in the world that could have coordinated the delivery of relief services in response to the tsunami the way Kofi Annan and the UN did in a very quick period of time. One final point before I close. We cannot make the UN, and we should not try to make the UN, a creature of U.S. foreign policy. It must be independent, and more importantly than that, it must be seen to be independent of great power manipulation. If the U.S. policymakers are successful in their effort to transform this institution into a creature of our national interests, a rubber stamp for U.S. policy, that'll be the end of the UN. It won't be able to function in those areas which is most important for it to function, where there's the threat of war and there's ongoing conflict requiring peacekeeping. The UN performs a vital function for the world, a function that no other organization can play, and the task is to make it better, stronger, and more effective, a more powerful and influential voice in international affairs, and to do so, to reform it without killing it in the process. Thank you very much. Now, nobody should tell me that someone has stolen our tent. That's you.
Yeah. The UN is many different things. One of the most fundamental things that is important to think about in the UN is the difference between the states and the staff, the secretariat and so forth, people who carry it. Now, you've made a case, a fairly persuasive case to me, that there is not much of a scandal involving the staff. But you've reinforced my view that there is a scandal involving the states. The states were the sort of the main contributors to this process. There were people pocketing money in Iraq. Maybe a UN staff wasn't, but there were in Iraq. There were probably people, I'm guessing, pocketing money in Russian and French companies or in Russian and French diplomatic corps even maybe. Could you comment on that? To what extent was there still something we would call scandal, which I understand to be rule breaking, among companies and states rather than inside the UN staff?
Look, I think you've got it right. I think there was, in any program that deals with hundreds of millions of dollars and cash flowing the way it was flowing in this kind of a program, unless you have very, very tight controls, there's going to be abuse. Was there rule breaking? Yes, there was. Was it of the quality and quantity as advertised? No, it wasn't. Should it have the ability to undermine the mission? It should not. Has it been a benefit because it's delivered a new impetus to reform? I think it has done that. Now, one of the questions is whether the UN should be in the business of running this kind of a program. And Paul Volcker asked the Secretary General that very question. Is this the kind of program that the UN should be engaged in? And the Secretary General said the following. He said, there is a problem with my job. I am charged with being the chief diplomat for the world. And where there's war breaking out in Indonesia or where there's war happening in East Timor, I am supposed to go there, set up a process to bring peace or establish peacekeeping. That's the chief diplomat's job. It's a full-time, if not a 200% time job. There is the other assignment of running the Secretariat, being the chief operating officer of the Secretariat. It's impossible for me to do both. And he says if I failed in the latter, it's because I was putting so much of my time in the former, which was the Balkans, East Timor, Iraq, peacemaking in Iraq, and all of that. And so what I would say is that the error here was an error of creation of this program inside the UN. There was no other organization, however, that could have negotiated with Saddam Hussein. If the Americans wanted an oil for food program established, they couldn't have gone to Saddam Hussein and say, let us run it for you inside Iraq. We would have been the last persons in the world that he would have negotiated with. So the UN had an absolutely vital mission in conducting the negotiations. At that point, though, he should have said, Saddam Hussein or whoever was Boutros-Ghali should have said, it's up to you who want this program, the US, the UK, the members of the Security Council, to run it. I'm going to subcontract that out to you. It'll be under UN auspices, but you're responsible for it. And so that the failures of the states then are not attributable to the organization itself, to the UN itself. And the UN suffered because of the failures of the states. And that's why I was so grateful for these senior diplomats to line up and say, it wasn't the Secretariat's fault, it wasn't the UN as an institution's fault, we failed. The governments failed, the states failed, and if that's a scandal, so be it. But it's not the nature of the scandal that was advertised and that was published so widely. Yes, ma'am.
Do you know John Bolton, and could you anticipate what his influence for the United States?
John Bolton, I do know John Bolton. I've appeared on panels with John, and we get along quite well. He also went to the same law school that I went to. He's much junior to me. No, I think he was only a couple of years behind me, actually. John is passionate. I mean, if you've seen him performing his public duties, he cares enormously about the United States and about achieving his objectives. He's also impatient. He's not the most diplomatic person in the world. But as far as I can tell, according to the Secretary General, he's working hard, and people respect the fact that he is working so hard and he's so committed to making the UN relevant. So I think he may well have a positive impact there. He came amidst a cloud of bad publicity. A very controversial nomination. He had a lot of enemies in the bureaucracy and adversaries, but I think he's done a good job so far. And by the way, there's no difference in this country between Democrats and Republicans, Bolton and his adversaries, on the question of reform. Everybody supports reform of the nature that John Bolton wants. The real question is, how do you go about getting it? Yes, ma'am.
In my opinion, it seems like a lot of the UN stagnation comes from the very structure of it, the General Assembly and the Security Council, and the veto that those 5 permanent members have. What is your opinion, the best way to reform that? And do you ever think it's possible because of the veto rights that those 5 countries hold and their obvious reluctance to let go of some of their power?
Well, it is a creature of the end of the Second World War. The Security Council. And actually, probably without those vetoes, as part of the established structure of the Security Council, you would not have had a United Nations, because the United States probably wouldn't have participated in it. And so let's begin by historically recognizing that those vetoes, institutionalized with those permanent 5, gave us the United Nations. Without that, probably they wouldn't have been participating, because then they would have been subject to the whim of a majority vote in the General Assembly. And there's no American president that would have agreed that our policy or our interests would be served by putting a vote to the 155 members of the General Assembly and then complying with the result. So there had to be some protections. But there's unanimity in the need for Security Council reform. And there was, in fact, a good deal of momentum for that in the early 90s. The feeling that France and the UK have permanent positions and vetoes reflects the fact that it's a product of the Second World War rather than a reflection of the reality of the world today. And there are many people who believe that Brazil, India, Japan, and maybe South Africa should also be named as permanent members of the Security Council. No one would agree to take away the veto from the existing 5 or to give vetoes to new permanent members, but it might be possible to increase the number of permanent members to reflect where the world population is more accurately and give representation to other continents. Another proposal is to have rotating permanent members, so that you would have someone from Latin America for 10 years, and the Latin Americans would pick who that person would be on the Security Council. But your basic point is absolutely right. Security Council must be reformed for it to maintain legitimacy. Japan is another applicant. In fact, much of the Japanese diplomatic efforts in the world today are in support of its application to be a permanent member of the Security Council. You're not going to change the vetoes, though, realistically. Thank you all for coming.